Okay, one of the last things that we need to cover as we finish up the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems concerns the routes that sympathetic neurons will take to get to their primary destinations. And so this is what we want to cover today. We want to understand, based on where we find synapses and where we find these neurons, can we predict what organs, what tissues these neurons are innervating? And we want to do that today. We'll maybe go with the skin, the lungs, the bladder. Anyway, there's a couple of different things that we can look at. So just as a reminder, we have learned that if we're thinking about the sympathetic system, we know they originate here between the thoracic vertebrae T1 down to the lumbar vertebrae L2, L3. That's where they come from. And if we zoom into this, what are we going to see? If we just look at a cross section, one of these days I'm going to get good at drawing those. There's a cross section of the spinal cord. The gray matter of the spinal cord. Of course, we got dorsal on this side, we've got ventral on this side, and maybe it's just nice to remind what we know so far, what we've learned so far. We learned in the last unit that sensory, for example, if we're talking about pain, or even if we're talking about proprioception with the muscle spindle, all sensory is going to come in through the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Of course, there's our dorsal root ganglion. The ganglion is a collection of cell neurons. What else did we learn? We learned that our motor, these are our lower motor neurons, they start in the ventral horn, and these are going to be efferents going in that direction, whereas the sensory were going in the other direction. When they converge right around this area here, they come together and form the spinal nerve. A nerve is just a collection of neurons outside of the central nervous system. During this, or within this range of T1 to L3, this is where our sympathetic preganglionic neurons originate. And we can find these starting right here, what we call the lateral horn. And let's now follow these if we were going to go to the skin. There's actually 4 different routes that we want to follow. We start laterally, we exit ventrally along with these lower motor neurons, and we follow this same trajectory as we join the spinal nerve. But immediately joining the spinal nerve, we take a detour, we exit. And this is important. We all pass through this structure right here that we're going to label the sympathetic chain ganglia. These are connected in a rostrolacaudal fashion, so they can even go up, they can go down. But we're going to come in here in the sympathetic chain ganglia. Just as a reminder, what is the ganglia? The ganglia is a collection of cell bodies, in this case where synapses occur outside of the central nervous system. So here's our sympathetic chain ganglia, very similar to the dorsal root ganglia on the other side, a collection of cell bodies. Now, if we're going to the skin, then what do we do next? Maybe as a reminder, we should consider the fact that if we're looking at the sympathetic system is characteristic with short preganglionics, long postganglionics. This is pre, this is post. We know that the preganglionic is myelinated, whereas the postganglionic is not. We know that the neurotransmitter here is acetylcholine. We know that it's acting or it's binding to N2 nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic terminal. And then the postganglionic neuron is typically releasing norepinephrine. So that's where we're at. This is the same thing that we're talking about. So this orange neuron that we just drew, this is all myelinated, and that's important because this bit right here where it comes out, because it's myelinated, that means it has a color to it. So this is going to be white, and because it's a branch off the spinal nerve, we call it the white ramus. All of the sympathetic preganglionic neurons will follow this route. However, what happens in the sympathetic chain ganglia will help us determine where they're going. Because we're going, in this case, to sweat glands, we are going to synapse and travel actually back into the spinal nerve. However, because we know that the postganglionic neuron is unmyelinated, therefore gray, we call this structure the gray ramus. And we know that if we follow that route, in other words, we synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglia, then follow the gray ramus back into the spinal nerve, this neuron will lead to superficial structures, primarily in the skin. So we're talking sweat glands, erector pili, things like that. I do want to put an asterisk right here on sweat glands because this is an exception. We need to remember that sweat glands, the neurons going to sweat glands, they actually are cholinergic and release acetylcholine onto muscarinic receptors. Again, this is for sweat glands only. It's a bit of a rule breaker simply because the muscarinics are all parasympathetic, except for right here on the sweat glands. It's sympathetic innervation, but muscarinic receptors. Okay, let's think about a different organ. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to start right here in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. We're going to exit ventrally. We're again going to come down here through the white ramus, and again we're going to synapse in the chain ganglia. But this time, instead of returning back through the gray ramus into the spinal nerve, this synapse is actually going to leave the sympathetic chain ganglia and head directly to its target tissue. And for this route, we'll say organs above the diaphragm. Primarily, this is the thoracic cavity. And when we think about the thoracic cavity, we're thinking heart. And we're also thinking lungs. Okay. Let's pick another route. Same thing. We're going to start here in the lateral horn. Exit through the white ramus. But this time, we're going to continue without synapsing. Our destination here is another ganglia that we're going to generally call a collateral ganglia. There are specific nerves, splanchnic, there's lots of different or different names for these collateral ganglia, but generally speaking, we'll just refer to it as a collateral ganglia. And we know that if we synapse in the collateral ganglia and then exit that ganglia with our postganglionic neuron, we are headed to organs below the diaphragm. In other words, abdominal pelvic cavities. This would include gut, stomach, intestines, bladder, reproductive organs, etc. That's the idea. Really anything below the diaphragm. All right, there's one last route that we have to follow. And again, we'll start up here in the lateral horn. All sympathetics start in the lateral horn. All sympathetics will follow this same route, joining the spinal nerve, exiting through the white ramus. But this time, we will pass through the spinal or the sympathetic chain ganglia. And we will also pass right through a sympathetic or a collateral ganglia. And in this case, there's only one destination we're going, and this is the adrenal gland. In this case, the adrenal gland itself, the adrenal medulla, is comprised of modified postganglionic neurons whose job is to make and release epinephrine. Just as a reference point, we know that the adrenal gland is sitting right on top of the kidney. And now we've got our 4 routes. So, in review, we know that all of our sympathetic preganglionics begin in the spinal cord from anywhere from T1 to L2, and that they all originate in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. They all exit ventrally, and as they exit ventrally, they will join the spinal nerve. But as soon as the spinal nerve comes together, all of the sympathetic preganglionics will exit. Because preganglionics are myelinated, we call that white versus gray, so that's the white ramus. All of these preganglionics will come into a sympathetic chain ganglia. Depending on where they're headed, the routes here may diverge. There are 2 routes that synapse within the sympathetic chain ganglia. The first is a route that will turn around and go back into the spinal nerve through the gray ramus. These neurons lead to the skin, anything superficial, blood vessels, sweat glands, erector pili. The second route, we see synapsing in the chain ganglia, but these, rather than go back into the spinal nerve, will just exit the chain ganglia and go to their organs. This is going to be really anything above the diaphragm, primarily the thoracic cavity, but it could also be anything up in the head, the eyes, for example. But if we're thinking about heart, if we're thinking about lungs, that's the route that they will take. The third route is to pass through the chain ganglia without synapsing, then synapse in the collateral ganglia. If we synapse in a collateral ganglia, then we know we're headed to an organ below the diaphragm, somewhere in the abdominal pelvic cavities. This is going to be gut, bladder, reproductive organs. And then the last route we discussed, we follow the preganglionic through a sympathetic chain ganglia, through the collateral ganglia without synapsing. This preganglionic neuron travels all the way to the adrenal gland, where it synapses on modified postganglionics that act to release epinephrine in an endocrine response.